You know what makes a trained war horse stop dead in its tracks? The Cossacks were the most legendary riders of the Russian Empire, warriors who mounted before they could walk. Their horses charged machine guns without hesitation. But on July 8, 1916, 47 Cossack horses refused to advance beyond 200 meters. Something stopped them. Something that's been classified for a century. Something that would change everything we think we know about World War I.
Cavalry had been the shock force of armies for millennia. The Cossacks represented the absolute elite of this military tradition. They weren't simply mounted soldiers. They were a complete warrior culture, forged in the steps of the Don and Kuban across generations. Children who learned to ride before they were 4 years old, men who could remain in the saddle for days without rest, riders capable of firing with precision from a horse at full gallop. The bond between a Cossack and his mount transcended the normal relationship between human and animal. Don-breed horses, raised specifically for cavalry warfare, shared generations with Cossack families. A horse could serve a warrior for a full decade of campaigns. These animals were trained from foals to withstand the roar of artillery, the crackle of machine guns, the absolute chaos of the modern battlefield. They'd charged fortified positions during the Napoleonic Wars. They'd participated in every Russian imperial campaign of the 19th century. In the Great War, Cossack Cavalry formed the spearhead of reconnaissance and exploitation operations on the Eastern Front. We know this history. Military records meticulously document the exploits of Cossack regiments, the medals awarded for valor, the successful charges against Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman positions. What we don't know, what's been systematically suppressed for over 110 years, is what those horses encountered in the fields near Lutsk. What object 47 experienced riders observed that made their mounts, trained for war, refuse to advance? What physical evidence was immediately confiscated by Russian military intelligence? And what happened to the men who insisted on reporting the truth about what they witnessed that July morning? Tonight, I'm going to share testimony that's been sealed in Russian military archives and scattered through forgotten Tsarist documents for over a century. Testimony about the day Cossack cavalry charged an object that shouldn't exist. About how 47 war horses stopped simultaneously at 200 meters distance. About the absolute terror these animals, trained to ignore fear, manifested. And about the price witnesses paid for refusing to accept the official explanation. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand the exact context of what was happening on the Eastern Front during the summer of 1916.
July 8, 1916. Lutsk, Volhynia, in what's now western Ukraine. The Brusilov offensive was entering its 5th week of operations. What General Alexei Brusilov had achieved defied all previous expectations about what was possible on the Eastern Front. Since the war began in 1914, the Eastern Front had been characterized by its fluidity, by vast maneuvers across immense territories, but also by a chronic lack of strategic decision. Russian victories in Galicia had been followed by disasters in East Prussia. Advances were frequently reversed by devastating German counteroffensives. But the Brusilov offensive was different. Launched on June 4, 1916, it had achieved massive territorial gains against Austro-Hungarian forces. The Austro-Hungarian Fourth Army under Archduke Joseph Ferdinand had been completely shattered. The breakthrough at Lutsk had opened an enormous gap in enemy lines. Russian forces were advancing rapidly through the open farmlands of Volhynia, pursuing disorganized retreating Austro-Hungarian units. It was, in many ways, the moment of greatest Russian military success of the entire Great War. The 3rd Cavalry Division had been deployed as an exploitation element. Their mission was to conduct deep reconnaissance operations ahead of the main infantry advance.
Identify enemy artillery positions, assess the strength of retreating units, locate advance routes for main columns, disrupt enemy communications. Classic cavalry operations in open terrain, the type of mobile warfare Cossacks had been trained for across generations. The weather was clear, temperature around 22 degrees Celsius, perfect for cavalry operations. Visibility was excellent across the flat terrain characteristic of Volhynia. Fields of recently harvested or half-abandoned wheat. Visible evidence everywhere of the hasty Austro-Hungarian retreat. Abandoned equipment, empty trench positions, deserted villages. Everything indicated the enemy was in full retreat. Conditions were ideal for aggressive reconnaissance. Under these perfect conditions, with the offensive developing successfully, nobody expected what was about to occur at 05:17 hours that morning.
Captain Ivan Sokolov, 29 years old, from Novocherkassk in the Don region, the traditional heart of Cossack culture. He'd served with the 7th Don Cossack Regiment since 1909, accumulating 7 years of active service before the Great War began. He wasn't some newly commissioned officer without experience. He was a veteran of multiple campaigns, a man who'd seen real combat under circumstances that would have broken less experienced soldiers. He'd been present at Tannenberg in August 1914, one of the most devastating defeats suffered by the Russian army during the entire war. He'd survived the chaotic retreat from East Prussia, while the German 8th Army under Hindenburg and Ludendorff executed one of the most perfect encirclement maneuvers in modern military history. He'd participated in the Gorlitz-Tarnów retreat in 1915, when the combined German and Austro-Hungarian advance had forced the Russian army back hundreds of kilometers, abandoning Poland and Galicia. He'd earned the Cross of St. George for valor during the siege of Przemyśl, one of the most prolonged and bloody engagements of the Eastern Front. Among his men, Sokolov was known as unshakable under fire, an officer who maintained composure during the most intense artillery bombardments, a rider who could control any mount, even in the most chaotic battlefield conditions. His squadron had charged Austrian positions on 3 separate occasions during the week prior to July 8th, operations that had resulted in casualties but also captured objectives and successful reconnaissance. His horse, a Don breed stallion named Grom, meaning thunder in Russian, had accompanied him for 2 full years of war. The animal had been personally trained by Sokolov since it was a foal. They'd survived together situations that would have killed less experienced riders. Grom had charged Austrian trenches without hesitation. He'd crossed ground under machine gun fire. He'd withstood the constant roar of heavy artillery. The relationship between Sokolov and his mount represented the ideal of the Cossack bond between warrior and horse. But nothing in his experience, nothing in his 7 years of military service, nothing in the Cossack equestrian traditions reaching back centuries had prepared him for what he and Grom would experience in the early hours of July 8, 1916. What happened at 05:17 hours would challenge everything Sokolov understood about war, about horses, and about what was possible.
At approximately 05:17 hours, Captain Sokolov was leading a reconnaissance patrol of 47 mounted Cossacks. The mission was standard for cavalry operations during a developing offensive: explore Austrian positions southwest of Lutsk, identify enemy artillery emplacements, assess the strength of retreating units, determine advance routes for the main columns that would follow. The patrol moved in standard formation through open farmland, recently abandoned wheat fields, clear evidence of the hasty Austro-Hungarian retreat. The Cossacks advanced in extended line, maintaining appropriate intervals to maximize reconnaissance coverage while minimizing vulnerability to enemy fire. Conditions were ideal: clear visibility in the early dawn, favorable terrain for rapid movement,
No indication of immediate enemy presence. Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, riding to Sokolov's right, noticed it first. A luminous object, stationary, approximately 800 meters away across a harvested field. He called Sokolov's attention to it. What the squadron observed over the next 11 minutes would absolutely challenge everything they understood about warfare, about physics, about the natural world they operated in as professional soldiers. A metallic sphere, brilliant silver under the early morning light, approximately 6 meters in diameter based on visual comparisons with known terrain features. But most importantly, and this was emphasized by multiple witnesses in their subsequent reports, the object was resting on the ground, not floating, not suspended in the air like an observation balloon, physically touching the earth, completely motionless despite winds of approximately 15 kilometers per hour that visibly moved the remaining wheat in surrounding fields. Absolutely silent. This detail appears in every single independent testimony. There was no sound of engines, no mechanical noise of any kind, no squeaking of machinery, no hissing of steam, no roar of combustion, nothing. The object existed in complete silence while the patrol observed it from 500 meters initially. Captain Sokolov used his field binoculars for detailed observation for 3 full minutes. The object appeared to have no visible seams, no rivets, no mechanical joints, no assembly lines. Its surface reflected the rising sunlight, but simultaneously seemed to absorb light, creating a visual effect Sokolov would later describe as impossible to adequately explain. There were no markings, no insignia, no indication whatsoever of origin, no symbol that could associate it with any known military force, not Russian, not German, not Austro-Hungarian, not Ottoman, not any other power involved in the conflict. But the most significant thing of all was the absolute silence, a detail that would acquire terrible significance in the minutes that followed. The Russian Cavalry Operations Manual of 1914 detailed meticulously every type of observation that required investigation during reconnaissance. Unidentified equipment in no man's land, potential enemy observation posts, abandoned artillery or supply caches, suspicious structures that might harbor enemy troops, any anomalous element in the operational area that could represent a threat or provide valuable intelligence. This object didn't clearly fit any of those established categories. However, standing orders required reconnaissance of any unknown element in the operational area. Sokolov, as an experienced officer following his instructions, made the decision to advance for closer observation. It wasn't a reckless or foolhardy decision. It was standard military procedure for investigating anomalies during reconnaissance operations. He ordered his squadron to form extended line, 47 mounted Cossacks in extended formation across 200 meters of front, the standard approach for investigating potential enemy positions, maximizing visual coverage while minimizing vulnerability to concentrated fire. At 05:23 hours, Sokolov gave the order to advance at a walk. The squadron moved forward in perfect formation. At 400 meters from the object, the horses showed no unusual behavior whatsoever. They advanced normally under complete control of their riders. At 350 meters, some horses began shaking their heads, a minor sign of unease, but nothing alarming. At 300 meters, several horses started actively resisting their riders, pulling on reins, trying to slow their pace. At 250 meters, every horse in formation began planting itself, actively resisting advance. At 200 meters, the entire squadron stopped, not gradually, not with some horses stopping first and others after, simultaneously, as if an invisible line had been drawn on the ground and no animal could or would cross it. 47 war horses, trained specifically for cavalry charges, hardened by years of exposure to artillery bombardments, accustomed to the incessant sound of machine gun fire, experienced in crossing terrain under direct enemy fire, all of them refused to advance a single additional step. And then the real terror began, something no military training could have prepared these animals to face.
According to testimony from multiple riders, documented in reports that were confiscated within hours but survive in fragments in personal letters and later interviews, the horses exhibited behavior none of the experienced Cossacks had witnessed before in years of military service. The animals' eyes showed white completely. In equines, this is an unmistakable sign of extreme terror, an indicator that the animal is experiencing fear beyond its normal processing capacity. The ears were completely flattened against skulls, another signal of absolute panic. Some horses began rearing despite the expert control of their riders. Others tried to turn and flee, fighting the reins with force that would normally be sufficient to unseat a less experienced rider. Several animals urinated involuntarily, a sign of extreme terror in horses that can't be faked or induced by simple nervousness. This is a physiological reflex that occurs only when an animal is experiencing fear that completely surpasses its normal stress response mechanisms. The Cossacks, men who'd spent their entire lives working with horses, immediately recognized this transcended any normal reaction to danger. Captain Sokolov, a rider with 7 years of military experience and a lifetime of Cossack equestrian tradition, tried to force Grom forward. The stallion, who'd charged Austrian trenches without hesitation, who'd crossed ground under machine gun fire without slowing pace, who'd stood firm during artillery bombardments that had broken less trained horses, absolutely refused. Sokolov applied spurs, the most direct and physical signal for a horse to advance. There was no response except increased agitation. The animal was willing to resist even direct physical stimulus rather than advance toward the object. Lieutenant Volkov tried the same with his own mount. Identical result. Sergeant Alexei Petrov, a Don Cossack with 12 years of cavalry experience, who'd participated in dozens of charges and reconnaissance operations, testified later in a letter to a relative, "I've ridden horses against artillery fire. I've charged machine gun positions. I've crossed rivers under enemy fire. Never in 12 years of service, and I felt a horse refuse to obey orders from pure terror. The animal wasn't being stubborn or disobedient. It was experiencing fear beyond anything I'd witnessed in an equine." This detail is absolutely critical to understanding what happened. These weren't civilian horses frightened by loud noises. They were war animals specifically bred and trained to ignore the most terrifying stimuli of the modern battlefield. The roar of heavy artillery that could be heard kilometers away, the constant crackle of machine guns, the visual and auditory chaos of a cavalry charge, grenade explosions, the smell of gunpowder and blood. These horses have been conditioned for years to function effectively in the midst of all that. Yet, before this silent object at 200 meters distance, all of them simultaneously manifested the most extreme level of terror a horse can experience. It wasn't simply that they refused to advance, it was that they were manifesting physiological signs of fear, indicating perception of an existential threat, something triggering survival instincts so deep they completely overrode years of rigorous military training. But what happened in the next moments would transform the horses' terror into something far more disturbing for the men riding them.
What happened next was documented by 47 independent witnesses whose testimonies, though officially confiscated, survive in sufficient fragments to reconstruct events with remarkable precision. The object began emitting light. Not light reflected from the morning sun. Light generated from within or beneath the metallic surface. A blue-white luminescence that intensified progressively for approximately 15 seconds. The horse's panic increased proportionally with the light's intensity. Some animals were now actively trying to throw their riders, extremely rare behavior in such well-trained mounts. Others had broken formation and were backing up despite their riders' commands.
The military discipline of the animals, forged during years of rigorous training, was disintegrating before whatever they were perceiving from that object. Then the object ascended. And the word ascended doesn't adequately capture what occurred. It didn't rise gradually like an observation balloon gaining altitude in controlled manner. It didn't climb laboriously like an aircraft of the era struggling against gravity with limited engine power. It ascended vertically in a single fluid continuous movement, from ground level to approximately 2,000 meters altitude in what witnesses consistently estimated as 3 to 4 seconds. To put this in precise technical perspective, no airplane in 1916 possessed vertical takeoff capability. The technology simply didn't exist. The fastest aircraft in active service, the French Nieuport 17 and German Albatros D3, considered high-performance machines for the era, had climb rates of approximately 500 to 600 feet per minute under optimal conditions. This represented the maximum that 1916 aeronautical technology could achieve in terms of altitude gain. This object covered 6,500 feet, approximately 2,000 meters, in 3 seconds. That represents a climb rate of 130,000 feet per minute, more than 200 times faster than the most advanced aircraft of the era. Speeds that wouldn't be achieved by human technology until the jet age decades later. But the physical evidence it left behind would be even more disturbing than the sighting itself.
Captain Sokolov, acting with the discipline of an experienced officer, immediately ordered his squadron to mark the exact location where the object had been resting. The patrol advanced toward the site. The horses, now that the object had departed, were willing to approach, though several animals still showed signs of residual nervousness. It was as if the source of their terror had been removed and their normal instincts were gradually reasserting themselves. At the precise location where the object had rested, the ground showed unmistakable evidence of physical contact, a circular depression approximately 6 meters in diameter. The wheat stubble within the circle was completely flattened in a spiral pattern radiating from center outward. The earth appeared compressed, as if it had been subjected to enormous weight for a prolonged period, though the object had been there for a relatively brief time. Sokolov ordered precise measurements to be taken. The depression was uniform, approximately 15 centimeters deep across its entire diameter. This uniformity was itself remarkable. If a heavy object had been placed there by conventional means, it would have created deeper compression in the center and shallower at edges, but this depression maintained consistent depth from edge to center point, suggesting completely uniform weight distribution or some type of applied pressure that didn't correspond to normal physical objects. There were no tracks leading to or from the site, no furrows in the earth indicating something heavy had been dragged to that location, no wheel tracks or drag marks, no mechanical residue, no smell of fuel or exhaust gases, no oil stains or hydraulic fluids, no evidence of conventional machinery that could explain how a 6-meter diameter object had reached that field and then departed vertically.
Lieutenant Volkov, demonstrating commendable initiative, collected soil samples from the compressed area. He used his empty canteen to store earth from the center of the depression. Sergeant Petrov created a detailed sketch of the flattened wheat's spiral pattern, working meticulously to capture the exact direction of the spirals and their geometric relationship to the circle's center. 3 additional Cossacks received orders to remain as guard at the site, while Sokolov rode back to division headquarters with his report. The intention was to preserve the area for more detailed investigation by intelligence or military scientific personnel. The 3 men established themselves in position, observing the site, waiting for additional orders. Captain Sokolov arrived at 3rd Cavalry Division headquarters at approximately 0630 hours.
He immediately requested audience with his regimental commander, Colonel Pyotr Krasnov. Over the next 40 minutes, Sokolov provided a detailed verbal report, followed by a written report he completed at 07:18 hours. The document included his sketch of the object, detailed descriptions of the horse's behavior, observations from multiple officers and soldiers, precise measurements of the ground depression, and a specific request that intelligence personnel investigate the site immediately. The report was processed through normal military channels. It was sent from regiment to division, from division to corps, from corps to Southwestern Front headquarters. Under normal circumstances, a reconnaissance report of this type would have received routine response, possibly some follow-up investigation if the details seemed militarily relevant. What happened instead was anything but routine. Because within 2 hours of submitting that report, Captain Sokolov would discover he'd crossed an invisible line, one that would change his life and that of all witnesses forever. Hit subscribe if you want to discover how Russian military intelligence responded to this report, because what's coming reveals the exact suppression mechanism empires use when soldiers see what they're not supposed to see.
Within 2 hours of the sighting, at approximately 07:30 hours, military intelligence officers arrived at 3rd Cavalry Division headquarters. Captain Grigory Markov from Stavka's intelligence section, the supreme headquarters of the Russian Imperial Army, accompanied by 2 subordinate officers. Their arrival was extraordinarily rapid. Too rapid to be a response to a routine report that had barely begun ascending the chain of command. This strongly suggests some type of protocol already existed for this type of incident, that reports of anomalous sightings triggered immediate and predetermined intelligence response, that this wasn't the first time something like this had been observed and reported, and that an established procedure existed to contain and suppress such reports before they could spread more widely through the military apparatus. Sokolov was interrogated for 90 minutes. According to a letter he wrote to his brother 4 days later, a letter that survived because his brother kept it for decades and eventually donated it to archives after the Soviet Union's fall, the interrogation didn't focus on the details of what he'd observed. There were no technical questions about the object's dimensions, no requests for clarification about the object's behavior, no interest in the scientific or military aspects of the sighting. Instead, the interrogation obsessively focused on Sokolov's mental state. Had he been drinking? How frequently did he consume alcohol? Had he experienced hallucinations previously? Did he understand the consequences of submitting false reports during wartime? Was he aware that spreading panic among troops was a punishable offense under military law? Did he understand that insisting on a report that couldn't be verified could result in charges of conduct prejudicial to military discipline? The nature of these questions reveals the strategy. They weren't investigating the incident, they were constructing an alternative narrative in which Sokolov was unreliable, possibly influenced by alcohol, potentially mentally unstable, and certainly confused about what he'd witnessed. They were establishing a foundation to discredit his testimony before even examining physical evidence or interviewing the other 46 witnesses. All written documentation was confiscated immediately. Sokolov's field notebook, containing his detailed sketch of the object and minute-by-minute observations of the incident. Lieutenant Volkov's map with the location marked precisely. The soil samples Volkov had collected from the site. Sergeant Petrov's sketch of the flattened wheat spiral pattern. Everything was requisitioned under military intelligence authority. Official receipts were provided, indicating materials had been confiscated for intelligence analysis, but no analysis was subsequently shared with Sokolov or his unit. The 3 Cossacks who'd been left to guard the site were ordered back to their unit at approximately 0900 hours. When they returned, intelligence officers were photographing the depression, multiple photographs from various angles, additional measurements being taken with topographical equipment, technical personnel examining the compressed soil and collecting additional samples. Clearly, military intelligence was taking the site very seriously and conducting detailed investigation. But by nightfall, all photographs and physical evidence had been removed from the area. The division's official records contain no reference whatsoever to this investigation. There are no copies of photographs in accessible military archives, no reports of soil analysis, no technical documentation of measurements. Everything simply disappeared into the classified intelligence apparatus. But confiscating evidence was just the first step. What they did with the human witnesses would be far more direct and brutal.
The 47 Cossacks who'd witnessed the incident were formally assembled that afternoon. They were addressed by Colonel Pyotr Krasnov, their regimental commander, an officer with considerable authority and respect among Cossack troops. According to multiple accounts surviving in letters and later interviews, Krasnov declared the squadron had observed an Austrian observation balloon that had been tethered in the field overnight and was being recovered when they approached. This explanation is technically impossible for multiple reasons any experienced cavalry officer would have immediately recognized. Observation balloons in 1916 were captive aerostats permanently tethered to steel cables anchored to the ground. They couldn't simply take off vertically at impossible speeds. Their ascent was slow and controlled via winch machinery. They required considerable ground crews, heavy vehicles to transport anchoring equipment, gas containers for inflation. There was no evidence of any of these elements at the site. Furthermore, observation balloons were large, typically 15 to 20 meters in diameter, constructed with materials visibly different from what witnesses described. They were fabric and net structures, not seamless metallic surfaces. They produced sound when ascending, the squeak of cables, the sound of gas being released or admitted, the noise of ground machinery. They didn't ascend in absolute silence. And crucially, observation balloons didn't terrify trained war horses. Military animals were routinely exposed to balloons during operations. They saw them frequently during reconnaissance. They didn't react with the type of extreme terror 47 horses had simultaneously manifested. The fear exhibited by the horses was attributed to the balloon's unusual appearance and some mounts' inexperience. This characterization is insulting to professional cavalry officers. The horses of the 7th Don Cossack Regiment weren't inexperienced mounts. They were war animals with years of active service. Grom, Sokolov's horse, had participated in dozens of combat operations over 2 years. Characterizing his reaction as inexperience was absurd. But the warning that followed was completely clear and devoid of any ambiguity. Any discussion of the incident outside official channels would be considered spreading panic among troops. This was a serious offense under Russian military law, punishable by rank degradation, arrest, or in extreme cases during wartime, court-martial and possible execution. The implicit threat was obvious. Accept the official explanation or face serious consequences. The men were dismissed. Most remained silent, clearly understanding the military apparatus had decided this incident wouldn't officially exist, that their direct observations, the testimony of 47 professional soldiers, the physical evidence they documented, all would be erased and replaced with an explanation anyone with basic military knowledge would recognize as impossible. But 2 men refused to accept this farce, and that refusal would mark them for elimination. Captain Sokolov and Lieutenant Volkov didn't remain silent. Both officers, with years of distinguished service, recognized the balloon explanation was technically impossible, and both, demonstrating courage that would eventually cost them everything, insisted on reporting the truth of what they'd witnessed. On July 12th, 4 days after the incident, Sokolov wrote a detailed letter to his brother, also an officer serving with the Russian army but stationed on a different front. The letter is notable for its tone of controlled frustration and its clear understanding of the implications of refusing to accept the official narrative. The document survived because his brother preserved it for decades, eventually donating it to the Russian State Military Archive in 2004 after new openness policies allowed depositing private historical materials. "They don't want the truth," Sokolov wrote. "They've decided what we saw, and our testimony is inconvenient for that decision. Volkov and I have insisted the offered explanation is impossible. No balloon moves as that object moved. No balloon leaves such impressions on the ground. No balloon terrifies 47 war horses simultaneously at 200 meters distance. We've been marked as problems. I expect transfer orders soon. If something happens to me, you must know I saw something that shouldn't exist, and I refuse to lie about it." This letter reveals several critical things. First, that Sokolov and Volkov had continued insisting on the truth of their testimony after the initial interrogation, despite implicit and explicit threats of consequences. Second, that Volkov clearly understood this insistence had marked them for punishment. Third, that he already anticipated transfer as a form of separation and silencing. And fourth, that he had sufficient concern about his personal safety to explicitly document his fears in a letter to his brother. Lieutenant Volkov, according to letters he wrote to his fiancée in Moscow during the same period, expressed similar feelings. "I can't accept an official lie when I know what I saw. 47 men witnessed the same thing. Horses don't lie about what they fear. The object existed, behaved in ways impossible according to all known technology, and left physical evidence that was immediately confiscated. Now they tell us it was an Austrian balloon. Anyone with basic military knowledge recognizes this as absurd, but insisting on truth has made us dangerous to someone in the chain of command." Both officers perfectly understood the situation. They weren't being punished for reporting inaccurate observations. They were being punished for being too reliable, for having too much credibility, for possessing sufficient technical experience to recognize the official explanation was impossible, and for having sufficient professional integrity to refuse accepting an obvious lie. Transfer orders arrived 6 days after the incident, July 18, 1916. Both Sokolov and Volkov received orders identical in structure, though different in specific destinations. Both were being reassigned to the Caucasus Front, a secondary theater of operations where Russian forces fought the Ottoman Empire in extremely difficult mountainous terrain. But these weren't simple routine transfers. They were death sentences disguised with military bureaucratic language.
The Caucasus Front in summer 1916 represented one of the most dangerous destinations available for Russian officers. Temperatures in lowlands regularly exceeded 35 degrees Celsius. Mountain warfare at high altitudes presented enormous logistical challenges. Supply lines were precarious at best. Casualty rates in some units approached 40%. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and cholera were endemic. Medical conditions were primitive compared to the main Eastern Front. Assignments to the Caucasus were typically reserved for officers being disciplined or who'd fallen from grace with their superiors. It was an established method to remove problematic individuals without the need for formal court-martial processes that might attract attention or scrutiny. You simply transferred the individual to a theater where survival odds were significantly reduced and allowed war to do the rest. Sokolov was assigned to a penal battalion operating in mountainous terrain against Ottoman forces near Erzurum. Penal battalions were units composed of soldiers being punished for various military offenses, led by officers who were also being punished. They were used for the most dangerous operations, the assaults with the highest casualty rates, missions considered virtually suicidal.
The expectation was many wouldn't survive, and that was precisely the point. Volkov was assigned to a cavalry reconnaissance unit operating in Caucasus lowlands, an area slightly less lethal than the mountains, but still considerably more dangerous than the main eastern front where he'd been serving. More important than physical danger, both officers were being separated from each other, removed from their original regiment, distanced from the 45 remaining witnesses who could corroborate their story. This is a classic institutional suppression tactic. Disperse witnesses, ensure they can't communicate with each other, eliminate the possibility they can coordinate testimony or support each other against official pressure. Isolate them in environments where their voices will be inaudible and their concerns irrelevant to new commanders who have no context of the original incident. Both officers departed July 24, 1916, less than 3 weeks after the sighting. Sokolov's last letter home, dated July 23rd, was delivered to his family in September 1916. The assignment is punishment for refusing to accept their explanation. Volkov and I know this. We've been removed not because we're unreliable, but because we're too reliable. We saw what we saw, and 45 more men witnessed the same thing. That truth is dangerous to someone. I don't know why. Watch the news from the Caucasus. If neither Volkov nor I return, you'll know why. And exactly as Sokolov predicted, neither officer would ever see the Eastern Front again. But what happened to them in the Caucasus would exceed even their worst fears. Smash that subscribe button if these punitive transfers are disturbing you, because the systematic elimination of witnesses coming next will reveal how far military empires will go to suppress what their soldiers witness on the battlefield. Captain Ivan Sokolov was killed August 29, 1916, during an assault on Ottoman positions near Erzurum. Officially, enemy rifle fire. His body was recovered by his unit 3 hours after the engagement. The medical report, filed by the battalion surgeon, noted a single bullet wound to the back of the head. Bullet entry at the base of the skull, execution style, exit through the forehead. The trajectory was inconsistent with fire from Ottoman positions, which were located forward and slightly elevated from where Russian forces were attacking. The shot had come from behind Russian lines, from friendly positions, from someone within Sokolov's own army. The battalion surgeon, Captain Mikhail Orlov, noted these inconsistencies in his official report and requested a formal investigation. The forensic details were unequivocal. The entry angle, the absence of other wounds, the fact that Sokolov had been found in a position suggesting he'd been struck while moving backward or while stationary facing Russian lines, not enemy positions. Everything indicated he hadn't been killed by enemy fire during the assault. Captain Orlov's investigation request was denied by Divisional Command within 24 hours. No detailed explanation was provided, simply an official notification that investigation wasn't necessary, that the medical report was sufficient as is, and that the matter was closed. Orlov, demonstrating considerable professional courage, submitted a second request. This time, he sent it through medical channels directly to Caucasus Front Medical Command, bypassing the normal military chain of command that had rejected his first request. He argued the forensic inconsistencies were too significant to ignore, that the recorded cause of death contradicted physical evidence, and that the integrity of the military medical reporting system required proper investigation of suspicious deaths. That second request was also denied, without additional explanation, without acknowledgement of the legitimate medical concerns raised, simply another bureaucratic denial. 2 weeks later, Captain Orlov died in a climbing accident while his unit was repositioning through mountain passes. He fell approximately 200 meters down a cliff face, no witnesses. The official report stated he'd wandered from camp in the night and lost balance in darkness while walking near the cliff edge. This explanation raises obvious questions.
Why would an experienced medical officer wander from camp at night in dangerous mountainous terrain? Why would he walk close enough to a cliff edge to fall without any nearby witness who could alert to the danger? Why did this occur exactly 2 weeks after he submitted his second formal request investigating suspicious death circumstances? Coincidences. But the pattern was just beginning. Because while Sokolov died under impossible-to-explain circumstances, Lieutenant Volkov faced his own form of systematic elimination.
Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov survived longer than Sokolov, but his end would be equally disturbing and even more mysterious. He was assigned to a cavalry reconnaissance unit operating in Caucasus lowlands, an environment with slightly higher survival rates than mountain penal battalions, but still considerably dangerous. According to letters he continued sending his fiancée in Moscow, letters she preserved for decades and eventually donated to historical archives, Volkov continued insisting on the truth of what he'd witnessed near Lutsk. He didn't accept the balloon explanation. He didn't abandon his testimony under pressure, and increasingly, he began feeling he was being watched. His final letter, dated October 3, 1916, is particularly unsettling. There are men in our unit who aren't regular cavalry. They ask questions about Lutsk. They know I was there. I've been ordered to cease all discussion of the incident completely, but these men know details that shouldn't be known outside intelligence circles. I believe I'm being monitored. If this letter reaches you and I don't return, you must know I told the truth about July 8th. 47 men saw what we saw. Horses don't lie. This letter reveals several critical elements. First, that there was unidentified or poorly identifiable personnel within Volkov's unit who didn't fit the normal profile of reconnaissance cavalry. Second, that these individuals were specifically interested in the Lutsk incident and Volkov's participation in it. Third, that they possessed detailed information about the incident, suggesting access to classified intelligence files. Fourth, that Volkov clearly felt his safety was at risk. Lieutenant Volkov disappeared October 19, 1916, during a routine patrol near Lake Van. His patrol returned intact. He didn't return. The other patrol members reported Volkov had been riding slightly behind the main formation. They'd heard the sound of a horse neighing behind them, and when they looked back, Volkov had disappeared. Search parties were deployed. They combed the area for 3 days. They found no trace of him, no body, no equipment, no signs of struggle or enemy action, no indication of where he might have gone or what could have happened to him. Ottoman forces in the area hadn't reported capturing Russian prisoners. Local Armenian and Kurdish units hadn't seen any Russian cavalry officer. He'd simply disappeared, as if he'd been physically erased from existence in the middle of a routine patrol in territory controlled by his own army. Officially, Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov is listed as missing in action. His name appears on the memorial at Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow, along with thousands of other Russian officers lost during the war. No grave, no body to bury, no closure for his family. Simply a name on a stone wall commemorating those who never returned. No formal investigation was conducted into his disappearance. Patrol reports were filed with a standard notation, MIA, presumed dead. No additional follow-up, no effort to determine what really happened during those moments when his patrol heard the horse neigh and he simply ceased to exist. 2 officers who insisted on the truth about July 8, 1916, both transferred to punitive assignments on a secondary front within 18 days of the incident, both dead or missing within 103 days of witnessing the object. Sokolov executed with a single shot to the back of the head in circumstances medical personnel recognized as suspicious. Volkov disappeared without trace during routine patrol. The doctor who questioned Sokolov's death killed in a climbing accident without witnesses 2 weeks after submitting his second investigation request. Coincidences.
But the elimination pattern extended far beyond the two principal officers, because every witness who'd insisted on truth, every man who'd refused to accept the balloon explanation, would face consequences following a statistically impossible pattern.
Sergeant Alexei Petrov, who'd collected the soil samples and created the ground pattern sketch, was promoted to lieutenant in August 1916, officially a reward for 12 years of distinguished service. The promotion came with transfer orders. He was sent to the Romanian front, which had just opened when Romania entered the war on the Allied side in late August 1916. The Romanian front would prove disastrous for Russian forces. Romania was rapidly invaded by combined German, Austro-Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Ottoman forces. The collapse was so swift and complete that Russian units sent to support Romania found themselves fighting desperate defensive battles while trying to avoid being encircled themselves. Casualty rates were catastrophic. Lieutenant Petrov was killed during the defense of Bucharest in December 1916. Official cause? Killed in artillery bombardment. His body was never identified, buried in a mass grave with hundreds of other casualties. No personal effects were returned to his family. No documentation exists about his service on the Romanian front beyond transfer orders appearing in 7th Don Cossack Regiment records. After August 28, 1916, there's no record of his existence beyond a line on a casualty list simply stating Lieutenant A. Petrov, KIA, Bucharest Sector, December 1916. Corporal Vasily Kuznetsov, one of 3 Cossacks ordered to guard the site after the object departed, died in November 1916. Official cause? Typhus. Supposedly, he contracted the disease while the regiment was in winter quarters from contaminated water. Medical records show he was isolated immediately upon showing symptoms. He died alone in the quarantine facility. No other typhus cases were reported in the regiment that winter. This is highly unusual. Typhus, when it appears in military units, typically spreads rapidly through multiple individuals due to close living conditions and shared transmission vectors. A single isolated case without additional transmission is statistically improbable. The medical officer who treated him, Captain Boris Lebedev, noted in a private letter to a colleague that Kuznetsov's symptoms were inconsistent with typhus. Lebedev described them as more consistent with poisoning, possibly from contaminated food or deliberate administration of toxic substance. The specific symptoms, disease progression, rapidity of deterioration, all suggested intoxication rather than typhus infection. Lebedev didn't file an official report of these observations. It's possible he already understood the fate of those who asked uncomfortable questions about suspicious deaths of Lutsk incident witnesses. 2 months later, Captain Lebedev was killed when his medical tent was struck by artillery fire during a German counterattack. The artillery strike was described as extremely precise, hitting only the medical facility and leaving surrounding structures intact. German artillery at that range was notoriously imprecise, typically employing area bombardment rather than precision fire against individual targets. That a single shell would specifically hit a medical tent while leaving everything else undamaged is extraordinarily improbable. Coincidences.
Private Ivan Morozov, another of the 3 site guards, survived the war. He returned to his village in the Don region in 1918 after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk took Russia out of the war. For 3 years, he lived in relative normalcy amid the chaos of the Russian Civil War. In 1921, he was interviewed by an investigator from the Soviet Academy of Sciences, documenting wartime experiences. The interview was conducted as part of a broader study of Cossack cavalry tactics. Morozov mentioned the July 8th incident during the interview. He described the object, the horses' reactions, evidence confiscation, the subsequent transfers and deaths of officers who'd witnessed it.
The investigator, a junior academic named Dmitry Pavlov, included Morozov's account in his field notes. Those notes were archived with the Academy in Moscow. 2 weeks after submitting his research, Pavlov was arrested by the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, on charges of counter-revolutionary activity. He disappeared into the Gulag system. No record of trial exists, no documentation of sentencing, no record of his final fate. His research papers, including the Morozov interview, were confiscated and classified. They didn't reappear in accessible archives until decades later, and then only in fragmentary form, with entire sections removed. Private Morozov died in 1922 during a Bolshevik grain requisition in his village. Official records state he resisted requisition and was shot while attempting to flee. Village witnesses, interviewed decades later during Khrushchev's de-Stalinization period, claimed Morozov was executed in his home without warning or provocation. He'd been telling his story to anyone who'd listen, about the object he saw in 1916, about how the horses refused to advance, about how evidence was confiscated, about how officers who insisted on truth were sent to die, about how the imperial military apparatus, and now Soviet, was actively suppressing testimonies about something that defied explanation. And then he stopped talking permanently, silenced by a bullet during a grain requisition witnesses said was really a targeted execution. Because the pattern didn't end with the war's end. The suppression crossed the Russian Empire's collapse, survived the Bolshevik Revolution, and adapted to the new Soviet regime as if nothing had changed except the uniforms.
The sighting occurred in July 1916. By July 1917, 14 of the 47 documented witnesses were dead. By war's end in November 1918, 18 were confirmed dead or missing. These weren't casualties uniformly distributed across normal units suffering typical combat mortality rates. These were individuals dispersed across different divisions, different armies, even different fronts, all dying or disappearing at rates defying normal probabilistic explanation. The statistical probability of this mortality rate, calculated by researcher Alexander Dmitriev in 2007 using Eastern Front casualty data, was approximately 3,600 to 1 against natural occurrence. These weren't men in the same unit suffering collective casualties in a single battle. They were individuals scattered across the Russian military apparatus, yet dying at a rate dramatically exceeding statistical norms for cavalry officers and soldiers during the same period. Sokolov, executed with shot to back of head. Volkov, disappeared without trace during routine patrol. Petrov, buried unidentified in mass grave after artillery bombardment. Kuznetsov died of typhus with no additional cases in his unit. Morozov, executed during Civil War after speaking about the incident. The doctor who questioned Sokolov's death fell from a cliff without witnesses. The doctor who questioned Kuznetsov's death, killed by precise artillery, leaving everything else intact. The investigator who documented Morozov's testimony disappeared into the Gulag without trial. This pattern extends beyond the Lutsk incident. Russian military archives, partially opened after the Soviet Union's fall, contain references to at least 7 similar incidents between 1914 and 1917 on the Eastern Front. Each follows identical patterns. Observations of objects with impossible capabilities, immediate military intelligence response, evidence confiscation, witness separation, subsequent deaths or disappearances of those who persist in their testimony. Tannenberg Sector, August 1914. Reconnaissance unit reported luminous object hovering over Masurian lakes during German encirclement. All witnesses transferred to separate units within a week. 3 killed in action within 2 months. 2 missing. Unit commander sent to the Caucasus front, where he died of unspecified disease.
Carpathian Front, January 1915. Artillery observers reported metallic sphere ascending from snow-covered mountains during night bombardment. Intelligence officers arrived within hours. Observers reassigned to different battalions. One killed an avalanche. Another disappeared during retreat. The third died in field hospital from wounds described as inconsistent with normal combat. Baltic Front, March 1916. Naval reconnaissance aircrew reported cylindrical object accompanying their seaplane at impossible speed. Pilot grounded indefinitely. Observer transferred to submarine service, where his submarine disappeared with all hands 3 weeks later. Third crew member developed nervous condition and was hospitalized, dying of complications a month later. And the suppression apparatus didn't just survive the Russian Empire's fall, it strengthened under the Soviet regime that replaced it.
Imperial Russian military intelligence archives related to these incidents remain sealed. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the archives were transferred to Soviet military archives. During the 1990s, limited declassification occurred when the new Russian government tried demonstrating transparency about the Soviet era. Archives related to the July 8th Lutsk incident were scheduled for release in 1998 under the 75-year rule. They remain classified. Access requests submitted by historians and researchers since 1998 have been consistently denied. Russia's Ministry of Defense states that release would compromise ongoing security operations. How 1916 documents compromise 2024 security operations has never been explained. No additional elaboration is provided. No detailed justification is offered, simply denied for national security reasons. Archives that have been released are heavily redacted. A 2003 FOIA release of intelligence summaries from the 7th Don Cossack Regiment for the July-August 1916 period included 260 pages. Of these, 180 were so heavily redacted they contained fewer than 20 legible words per page. Sections corresponding to dates around July 8th were completely removed, with notation exempt under Article 23, National Security. No photographs of the site exist in accessible archives, no soil analysis reports, no technical documentation of measurements. The sketches created by Sokolov and Petrov remain missing. The soil samples collected by Volkov were never returned. Everything simply disappeared into the classified intelligence system, first Tsarist, then Soviet, now Russian again, as if the political structures that collapsed and were replaced didn't matter in the slightest when it came to keeping certain secrets. The suppression pattern crosses two completely different regimes, survives massive revolutions, remains operational for over a century. This suggests whatever those Cossacks witnessed on July 8, 1916, is considered important enough to keep classified regardless of which government controls the archives.
Hit subscribe if this video changed your perspective on what was really happening on World War I battlefields, because every week we break down the stories military archives don't want you to know, the testimonies suppressed for a century, and the patterns connecting inexplicable incidents across modern history's greatest wars.